Hey everybody, welcome to the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina, Kristina, and it's nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I'm trying, I'm learning sign language again. I did it a long time ago, and I'm trying to learn some more because of my books that I'm going into. This is the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina. This is where I'm a series person. I like to read series. So please check out Flashback Mondays. We are doing Romantic Time Book Review magazine. That magazine did over 250 books a month. So I hit on a variety of books that you may be interested in, all different categories: historical, mystery, romance, paranormal, sci-fi, inspirational, modern romance, contemporary romance, they call it. So please check that out on Mondays. Star Trek Fridays. That used to be my biggest video of the week, and for whatever reason, it's flopped huge, massively. Also, my new series on Fridays, If Then. If you like this author, maybe you'll like this author. And then, of course, my daily book reviews, which this is my daily book review. This is book 2 in Victoria Thompson's Gaslight series. And we are learning the sign language in honor of Brian, Frank Malloy's son. The book starts out with someone is murdering these young ladies who like to spend a little time at a social club in the evenings. They are not prostitutes or anything like that. They live at home with their parents. They're making a little bit of a wage in one of those sweatshops, and they just like a little entertainment, and some of them go dancing to try to meet guys and maybe make a nice husband and get a few dollars. In the meantime, someone is killing these young ladies, and when we start the book off, there's 3 ladies already dead. And one of the ladies who just recently died, Sarah Brandt delivered this. This woman is her client, and she's expecting a baby any day now. So when Sarah Bryant is fetched to come to the house, she thinks the woman is in labor, but when she gets there, the woman is wailing all over the place because her sister has been murdered. And the police, because they're low income, because they don't have the money to bribe a police officer or anything like that, the murder is not going to get solved. So while she's there, and the woman has been so upset and distressed, she actually has been in labor, and the woman hasn't noticed it because she's been too busy wailing over her sister. So Sarah delivers the baby, and she continues to check on her during the week, and the mother is so depressed that she's not taking care of herself or the kid. And Sarah warns her, the kid could die if you don't feed her. And the mother's like, but she's so quiet, she's so good. But yeah, she's so quiet and she's good, but you still need to feed the kid. So we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, Sarah has had a revelation about Brian. She goes over to see him. Wait a second, just a second. She knows that Frank's mother doesn't approve of her. I don't know if she knows of Sarah's wealthy background. Sarah is a Knickerbocker. She's very, very wealthy. However, she wants to live on her own. She wants to make it on her own terms. She had a falling out with her parents because her sister, as we discovered in book 1, her sister died in childbirth because they didn't have the money to seek health care. And because her father had played the hardball trying to get the girl to come back, and she ended up dying. So the father is regretting that a little bit. And because Sarah Brandt's husband was murdered, they were also thinking that Sarah might actually come back to them. And she hasn't. She's making her own living as a midwife because her husband was a doctor and she learned the tools of the trade from him. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I see you. She's here. She's here. And we also have, so there's Sarah, the midwife, and Frank Malloy is the detective sergeant who does the investigating, who she's established a relationship with in the last book. And Mrs. Ellsworth is her neighbor, and we will be talking about her. And also Frank's mother, Mrs. Malloy. And so Sarah has been to this woman's house. She's delivered her baby. She's massively distraught that the police will never investigate her sister's murder and the guy will go free. And Sarah says, well, I know somebody, maybe he can help you out. So she goes to Frank Malloy's apartment and she has words with his mother, who really doesn't approve of her at all, does not approve of her. And Sarah does she brings a toy for Brian, and he very cleverly takes it apart and puts it together, and the bells start clicking in Sarah's brain. So she does the investigating, and she talks to Frank and tells him, look, I know a doctor that could help with the club foot, and I also believe that your son is deaf. He's not feeble-minded or anything, he's deaf. And deaf people can lead normal lives. They can get jobs, they can have spouses, they can have children, they can read, write, do arithmetic, and they can talk. They talk with their hands, sometimes they can read lips, but they have lives. There's blind people in this world, there's deaf people in this world, there's Helen Keller in this world. And so she's trying to convince Frank that he needs to do this. And he does one little step each book. And I think it takes a lot for Frank. His mother acculates much, much better than Frank does. But he does it in slow steps. And when he finally gets to it, he gets better at it. So that's the two little cases that's going on in this book. The murder of these young women who are just trying to have a little bit of a social life at a young age on a very limited financial status. And so Sarah gets involved and she starts investigating and assisting Frank in the investigation. She goes to the social club. She gets to know the dead girl's friends, and she makes all kinds of acquaintances, and she learns who they were going out with and stuff like that. She even sees one of her family acquaintances, and because she wants to pick this guy's brain, but she can't do it, she can't go to his house and, hey, I want to ask you some questions. No. So she has her parents arrange a dinner party, and this forces Sarah to mingle with her parents and to start a communication going on with them. Her mother's pretty good with talking to Sarah, but her father's got to get past some of the impediments of her being able to stand on her own 2 feet. His daughter, aghast, how dare she try to make a living on her own without my help and support. And it's going to take a while for Sarah's father to work it in his head, like it's going to take a while for Frank to work it in his head about his son. So I have to, when I read these books, I have to share them with you. So she says, Detective Sergeant Malloy, Mrs. Brandt didn't tell me you were expected. I'll take myself off so you can discuss whatever it is you need to discuss, she said with a sly grin. That's kind of you, ma'am, Frank said, wishing he didn't feel embarrassed. He had nothing to feel embarrassed about. This meeting was strictly business. The old woman rolled her eyes as she gathered her things to leave. I guess I should have expected Mr. Malloy. I broke a needle today, and yesterday I saw 3 crows together. Mrs. Brandt smiled patiently. Does that mean a visitor is coming? Oh, no, Mrs. Ellsworth said smugly. Both those things mean a wedding. I'll be off now. You two enjoy your afternoon." As soon as the old woman had disappeared through the gate connecting the 2 yards, Mrs. Brandt said, "Don't look so terrified. Her omens hardly ever come true." "I'm not," he began, then caught himself. He wasn't going to get into a conversation about that. He cleared his throat. "I talked to the detective who's investigating the girl's death, and they sit down and discuss the case." Um, so she does all this stuff, and then uh, we have Mrs. Ellsworth again. I'm gonna do a video on Mrs. Ellsworth. I think I'm gonna do that. Um, so uh, "Mrs. Brandt, are you off to deliver a baby?" a voice called as Sarah descended from her front step the next evening. "No, not this evening," Sarah replied to her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ellsworth, who never seemed to miss a single event that happened in their neighborhood. Mrs. Ellsworth spent an inordinate amount of time sweeping her front steps just so she'd have a good vantage point. That's what she was doing now, but at least she had an excuse. The showers that had fallen through the city the day before had left leaves and small twigs in their wake. "I'm going to meet some friends." "Not that nice detective sergeant?" No, I'm afraid not," Sarah said, unable to hide her smile. She wondered what Malloy would say to being characterized as nice. "Are you expecting visitors then? I found a button today while I was cleaning upstairs, which means I'm going to make a new friend. I wonder if you've got any babies due soon. If someone comes while you're out, I'll certainly take a message for you." "No babies due that I know of, but certainly take a message if anyone comes by." I love Mrs. Ellsworth. And then Frank goes to the school. And Frank knew he was probably going to make a fool of himself. He didn't know the first thing about schools or education, particularly education for children who were deaf, and his son was deaf. He confirmed that with a trip to a doctor Sarah Brandt had said was competent enough to make a judgment, who said nothing could be done for Brian's hearing. He had been born deaf. That was the final verdict. He'd been interested in Brian's foot too, but Frank wasn't going to let just any doctor take care of them. When he felt he had built up enough credit with Mrs. Brandt that she owed him a favor, he'd ask her to make him an appointment to see her surgeon friend. Until then, he was going to see what he could find out about educating a deaf child. Not that he believed a deaf child could be educated. If you couldn't hear, how could you learn to do anything else? It's called sign language. It's called learning other means of communication. It means writing stuff down, showing pictures. This is an apple. A-P-P-L-E. A-P-P-L-E. Spell it out. Picture. And sign language. Lip reading. Writing notes. There are other ways of communication than talking. The sign over the door on Lexington Avenue said New York Institute for the Improved Instruction of Deaf Mutes. Deaf mutes, that was Brian all right. Frank liked the way it says improved though. That must mean they used the best methods here. Inside the place was eerily quiet. The halls were empty and still, but he supposed was the way any school was when classes were in session. Here, of course, there would be no need for noise at all, since the students couldn't hear it anyway. He entered the first room he came to, which was obviously administrative offices of some kind. A young man sat behind a desk, carefully transcribing a letter, when Frank walked in. He looked up and smiled politely. He looked to be less than 20, his face still spotted and his body thin with immaturity. "I'd like to speak to someone about my son," Frank said, conscious he was speaking louder than normal, or maybe it just sounded that way because the place was so quiet. "Sit down, please," the young man said, although the please sounded more like peas. He indicated the chair beside the door, and Frank took a seat while the boy disappeared into the office. And Frank meets with the director, Edward Higginbotham, and Mr. Higginbotham explains to him about lip reading. And then later on, well, we'll get to that. This is okay. So then Sarah goes to talk with her parents, and I think it's a good uh, form of they're trying to break down the walls. They're trying to work on their issues, especially the father. Please sit down, her mother said too brightly. I'll ring for tea. Sarah sat in the chair beside her father, amazed at how her hands ached after he released them. He'd been clinging so tightly he almost bruised them. They chatted about the weather and Sarah's trip uptown. Her father was probably horrified that she'd taken the elevated train, but he managed not to betray it until the maid had finished serving and left them alone. When the door closed behind her, an awkward silence fell. They all knew someone must say something momentous, but no one quite knew what that something should be. Perhaps her father thought she should apologize for abandoning them, but she wasn't going to do that. She had been the one offended and felt that she was the one due an apology. She couldn't imagine her father would apologize for anything in his life. To do so would be to admit he'd been wrong, and he probably believed he had never been. I missed you too, she said honestly. Although she had friends and a profession that fulfilled her, nothing and no one could take the place of family. Not even a family who hurt each other as much as hers had. Your father has regrets too. How many people have your mother's talk for your father? How many people go, oh, your father feels this way when he's sitting right there in the room, stone cold silent? Do you have your father? Does your mother talk for your father like that? Um, your father regrets, we both regret the harsh words that were spoken after poor time. I'm sure we all regret that, Sarah said quickly, coming to her mother's rescue. Had her father asked her mother to apologize for him? No, she realized, judging his expression. His patience was in evidence. But to his credit, her father chose not to argue. Instead, he said, you've always had a mind of your own, Sarah. You're very much like me in that respect. Too much like you, perhaps, she allowed with a small smile. Yes, but it's also less acceptable in a female. To some people, Sarah says. Always to a father, he countered. I never intended to let so much time pass with matters unsettled between us. But before I knew it, 3 years had gone by. I don't know how it happened. Nor I, he agreed, but he looked relieved at her willing to take the blame. She hoped so. I should have been more understanding, she laughed. I realize now that you were only concerned about my well-being. Her father was prepared to be equally gracious, and we probably should have given you some time to get over Dr. Brandt's death before discussing her future. And it goes from there. And Sarah's like, look, I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I'm a midwife. You need to accept this. And it's going to take a few books for the stuff between her parents to work out. It's going to take a few books between Frank Malloy and his son and working out those issues there. And then Frank goes to the other institute, the one that does sign language, and he talks to them. Frank had located the New York Institute for the Deaf and Dumb without too much trouble. It was, he learned, a much older school than the one on Lexington Avenue. This one had been here over 60 years, a long time. If they were doing something wrong, Frank thought critically. This school was as silent as the other had been. He entered the main office. The young man working there as a clerk looked up. May I help you? He asked, moving his hands quickly in a way Frank had never seen before. Frank realized this must be the sign language Mrs. Brandt had told him about. I'm not deaf, Frank told him, unconsciously speaking too loud. Neither am I, the boy replied with a smile, using his hands. Frank was certain it was sign language. Do you have a business with Mr. Pete? Do you have business with Mr. Pete? Is he the one in charge? Oh, I've got to show you. There's a ham on the floor. Oops. Just load. Okay, so where was I? Is he the one in charge? Yes, sir. His father founded the school. Then I guess I do have business with him. I'll see if he's free, the boy said, and disappeared into an inner office. Frank didn't quite know what to expect when he was ushered in to meet Louis Pete. He was relieved to discover Pete wasn't deaf and he didn't use his hands when he spoke the way the boy had. Frank told him about Brian and he listened intently. Ah, there she goes again. If you want to know her identity, check out my New Year's Eve video. But she's always going off. Bing. Oh, she finished. Excellent. I went to the Lexington Avenue School first, he told Pete. An excellent facility, he said tactfully. They said they could teach my son to speak. Pete nodded. I'm sure they did, but they introduced you to a student who could speech, read, and talk? Yes. His voice was a little odd, but I could understand him. He could understand me too. If my son could learn to do it, he would be able to make his way in the world. But the boy you heard wasn't born deaf, was he? Frank frowned. How could he have known? No. When someone is born deaf and never heard human speech or sound of any kind, it's very difficult for them to ever learn to speak clearly. It's almost difficult for them to understand the concept of language because they have no language of their own. Frank wasn't sure he understood all of this completely, but some of it sounded reasonable. You do something different here at your school than they do at Lexington Avenue, Frank said. You teach them to talk with their hands. Yes, we teach them sign language. You may have seen deaf people using it on the streets. The boy outside used it. He always does. If he suspects he might be talking to a deaf person, sign language is a unique method of communication. Many people assume the signs are letters of the alphabet spelling out words. But if you think about it, you realize that would be a cumbersome method and very slow and boring to use for actual communication. Actually, the signs are words. Motions representing what we in the hearing world hear as sounds. A skilled signer can speak quickly as you and I can speak with our voices, and one who understands the signs can comprehend as easily as you understand what I'm saying now. But how do they talk to people who don't know the signs? Ah, that's the problem, is it? Pete said, sitting back in his chair, steepling his hands in front of him. If we could get everyone in the hearing world to learn sign language, then deaf people could get along just like hearing people. Yeah, if you can teach German to the world, and you can teach French to the world, and you can teach Japanese to the world, why can't you treat sign language as another language? That's what it is. It's a language. And you should make that a required course in all the schools, and then everybody would know sign language. And it would be a universal language. But on the other hand, learn this. A sign doesn't have an accent. A sign is the same word in all languages. Hi is hi in any language. You can go anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, and do these signs, and they will know them. They will learn them. They will know. Father, mother, brothers, sister. These are universal signs. Everybody, all deaf people around the entire world speak the same language, sign language. Which means that the Lexington School has a better solution. He goes, that's the problem, isn't it? If we could get everyone in the hearing world to learn sign language, then deaf people could get along just like hearing people. Since that doesn't seem likely to happen, what happened is that the deaf develop their own society. They work at trades which don't require hearing or speech. They marry other deaf people to whom they can speak easily with signs, and they socialize with other deaf people, which means that the Lexington School has a better solution. Frank said their students can speak and read lips. They can communicate easily with hearing people and lives in their world, except they don't. What do you mean? Pete smiled. The theory behind the oralist method, that the method of teaching speech, reading, and speaking the Lexington School uses, is to give the deaf students the skill to allow them to live and work and socialize with hearing people. In practice, however, they don't do that. In fact, the graduates of the Lexington School have actually organized their own social club, the Deaf Mute Union League. which has only deaf members. They have lectures and meetings and dinners and balls for the deaf. They still associate primarily with each other and work together and marry each other. If you are a fan of the United States Big Brother, that's a show that comes on that I watch religiously. Um, they put a bunch of people in a house, and the last one standing is the winner. So they compete for a head of household. The head of household puts two people on the block. Then they compete for the power of veto. And if someone wins the power of veto, either the two people on the block or a friend of theirs, they can remove the person from the block and they can put another person up. And then at the end of the week, the house votes on who goes home. And why I bring this up is because last year we had our very first deaf contestant. However, he was a lip reader and not a signer. And I do 100% believe he might have done a little bit better if he could have taught the other people in the house to do some sign language. And they could have made ASL an important thing. But what they did was he depended on lip reading. And the problem with lip reading is if I'm talking over here, you can't hear me and that's what happened. And he missed a lot of conversations because people weren't looking directly at him. And he didn't admit it while he was during the show, but after the show and they interviewed him, he explained all this information that he didn't understand most of the conversations in the room because he couldn't hear them and people weren't looking directly at him when they were speaking. So it's a big issue there. So please understand, Mr. Malloy, I'm not criticizing what they do with the lexicon school. I'm simply pointing out that their results have not been any more successful than ours for deaf people, especially if your goal is to give your son the skills he will need in life. And for someone like your son who probably would never learn to speak clearly enough to be understood or to read lips well enough to truly comprehend, it would be a frustrating and ultimately a fruitless experience. Of course you think I should send Brian here, Frank said. Your son is too young to send anywhere at the moment. When he's older, I think he would do very well here. Probably better than he would at Lexington Avenue. But you have some time to find out more about theories of educating the deaf. In the meantime, I suggest you meet with some deaf people and find out their experience. I would be happy to introduce you to a family I know who has a boy Brian's age. Oh no, he can hear perfectly, but his parents are completely deaf. So the kid learned sign language because his parents were deaf. But because of sign language, he can talk to them and they can talk to him. And that opens the world. A hearing person can learn sign language. And that opens the world. It's just another language, like learning German, Latin, Italian. If you can learn the language, you can talk to somebody. And that opens the world to deaf people. If the hearing person is willing to learn sign language, that opens the door of communication, and a deaf person and a hearing person can converse just like someone is talking German or Japanese to an English person. They can learn to converse. They can learn each other's language. So anyways, I don't think there's any more Ellsworth. Oh, one more Miss Ellsworth before we leave for the day. And please check out my If Then on Fridays, please. The next morning, Mrs. Ellsworth was on Sarah's doorstep bright and early, her wrinkled face pale and drawn, her graying hair done up so hastily, the knot sat crooked on her head. Oh, Mrs. Brandt, I had to see that you were all right. I had the most terrible dream last night and then this morning. She clutched at her chest, grasping for breath, and Sarah quickly took her arm and led her inside. She sat down right here and let me listen to your heart. Are you in any pain? Goodness, no. I can't seem to catch my breath. I was so frightened when I saw it. The dream, you mean? No, the cricket. Sarah was just about to put the stethoscope in her ears, but stopped at this. You were frightened by a cricket? Not just any cricket. Everyone knows that a cricket in the house is good luck, unless it's a white cricket, of course. And this one was pure white, and you know what that means. Mrs. Ellsworth closed her eyes and laid her hand over her heart again. She reached out, but fully expecting to keel over and ready to fall, but she didn't move. She says a white cricket means death. So, to find out how Sarah and Frank Malloy solved the murder of those girls, the serial killer, and she's playing off camera. She's all cute and playing over there, but not over here. But anyways, so please check it out. Murder on St. Mark's, and please continue my journey reading all of the Gaslight series. I'm going to do Sky O'Malley in pieces, I think. But please hit the like and subscribe and let me know I'm doing a good job. And don't forget Flashback Mondays and Star Trek Fridays and Star Trek If Then. Thank you.